Can everybody hear me? And I'm so sorry to be late. Welcome aboard, everybody. Let me know if you can hear me, first of all. Getting his tea ready, Slow Kettle. Thank you so much for understanding. What we're going to do, if you first let me know if you can hear me, is just honor all the people who've left questions in this waiting room. And then we'll jump to whatever questions are coming up as we chat. But first of all, let me just say a couple of things. I just saw images of Putin about now in Crimea, and he looked light and heavy at the same time. He was heavy because he's in a very difficult position. He knows that there are few positive moves available for him in the months to come. But there is also a lightness there. And the lightness for me is to do with the fact that he feels that even though he is completely isolated, and even though this ICC thing sort of symbolically elevates this perception of isolation, he's actually ultimately not alone, because he will be better understood, he thinks, by the history that comes after. So there's a kind of sincere understanding there, misunderstanding, that once the history books settle themselves, they'll really understand how reasonable it is what he's trying to do. So it's quite a fascinating observation. Let me say something just a little bit symbolic about the International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Mr. Putin. And I'll just say something symbolic because I've left a little video on this channel, on the chat channel, about this. And I think what's so striking about it is that Mr. Putin is suspected of individual criminal responsibility for what seemed to be 164 definite cases, but that's just a drop in the ocean compared to the real number, of children being moved from one ethnic group to another. And of course, several people with arrest warrants for them too, in fact, in the past, were acquitted. And this court, even though we know Mr. Putin is morally guilty here, could conceivably on this count acquit Putin if there isn't clear, procedurally demonstrable evidence of a top-down connection. And so the reason that's moving is that that's the very antithesis of Russia. That's the very antithesis of this sort of fluid tyranny in which even the appearance of procedural adequacy has been abandoned. So that's, I think, very, very important, because in this community, we care about institutions, we care about procedure, even if these institutions are painfully slow or painfully doing the wrong thing. We know that for us to get what we want, we're going to have to push it through institutions that work with checks and balances, that there is no other way. Let me say something about the war briefly, and that's that I think that Putin is feeling he's in a stronger place right now than he was, let us say, in September, October time. He's playing a waiting game, and he feels a certain kind of relief at the lack of Western commitment to bring about a Ukrainian victory as rapidly as possible. He believes that he could find a way through this, even though that way through isn't clearly available for him. And that's worth bearing in mind, especially for all of you who are in a go Ukraine informational environment, right? And I teased this community for a tiny percentage of you being shocked by the suggestion that the West is committed to Ukraine's survival and Ukraine's independence, but not Ukraine's complete victory. A few questions have come in about this, so we'll come back to this topic, but I just wanted to put this on the table to be clear about what we are doing with our support for Ukraine at the moment and what we are not doing. So let's go and have a look at some of these questions. I think Jeremy asked, could I make a video that explores Putin's ideology compared to others historically found in Russia? Jeremy, I will. So let me just say a couple of fairly random but illuminating things. Thank you so much. I hope you're feeling good too. There are a couple of differences between the Putin regime and the Stalin regime. One is that Stalinism was utterly close to the idea of distributing and diluting the monopoly over organized violence. Right? And that wasn't something that fascist regimes were as close to as the Stalin regime was. So here is a difference. It's very anti-Stalinist to bring about a situation where you've almost got semi-autonomous armies developing on Russian territory. And another difference is that certainly in many fascist regimes, it's clear who the people who might disappear are. Right? And actually, that's roughly so with Putin. You're simply not going to have anything go wrong with you if you sort of don't criticize the government in Russia. Whereas under the Stalin regime, repression was arbitrary. That wasn't a bug, that was a feature. So these are a couple of differences, but we'll talk more. The ideology, Jeremy, is never going to be coherent. It's not like he's read Ilyin and then applied that in practice. So there's a lot of illuminating stuff that comes out of Tim Snyder associating Putin with Ilyin, but it also mustn't be overestimated. Blind Soldier is asking, how can Ukraine win without the other side losing? I don't think Ukraine can win without the other side losing. Dmitry, hello Dmitry, is saying, do you agree with the statement that complete victory is impossible without regime change? I agree with the statement that Mr. Putin is irreversibly committed to this war, by which I don't mean a war against Ukraine, I mean a war against the West, and that he can halt this war, but not extricate himself from it. So there is a connection between this Kremlin pattern of escalation and regime change. But we have to understand what we mean by regime change, right? If Mr. Putin is gone, but all of the folks around him have stayed, is that regime change? Is that not regime change? And on that conversation goes. Hirt is asking, is Putin currently in a better or worse position than before the invasion? So I've just said he's in a better position than he was in September. Is he in a better position than he was before the invasion? He's in a much worse position, in my assessment, than he was before the invasion, because while he has centralized more power in his hands, his hold over that power is more vulnerable. He had less power before the war. Other people around him had more power, and he took it from them. And the war was an opportunity to do that. But his hold over it is more fragile. Before the war, it wouldn't have been a remotely strange thought to say, well, this guy's going to die in office. Now, there's plenty there to think that that might not happen. Max, if Putin is on a historical mission, could Zelensky be on a historical mission too? No, unless Zelensky happens to undemocratically stay in office for 25 years, then he could develop his own sense of mission. Zelensky's mission is to get these damn Russian soldiers off his territory at the moment and to guarantee his country's sovereignty. So is very far from that. But just about anybody could develop a sense of mission if they're at the top of a tyrannical regime for a very long time. MVJH is saying, on the question of the efficacy of getting rid of oligarchs, is it good for a leader to have that many enemies? If you're talking about people falling off balconies and out of windows, the preponderance of that is not sort of vertically orchestrated political assassination, contrary to what the Sun newspaper might report. I'm just saying the Sun hypothetically. I haven't checked if the Sun have been doing that. I think there is another question here that I can see about Putin's court, so we'll come back to this. Dorgesh is saying, have the democratic values of the Baltic states diffused into Russia at all? Into the younger generation of Russians to some extent, yes. Pool, how you doing? Is asking, how does what Putin's accused of compare to basically the Nazi story in the middle of the 20th century in terms of expansionism? That's a fascinating direction in which to go. So let me just say one thing. What is unique about Russia's sort of ethnic prejudices about Ukraine and Russia's imperialist attitude to Ukraine is that Ukraine is not seen as an other that one might civilize or take over. Ukraine is seen as just Russia, and there's a bunch of Russians there who've forgotten they're Russian. So it fails to fit this typical mode of racial colonial dispositions. And that's why, as the Russian imperial project is in its death throes, this is so much more painful for it than losing Poland or losing East Germany, because this is now no longer a kind of periphery that's being lost, a kind of other that one should own that is being taken away, but there is a bit of one's own center that's falling off. Julia is talking about the sources of anti-Americanism. Well, this would be a very long conversation about American interventions around the world, military interventions, regime change interventions, indirect interventions, US military presence all over the world. And then there'd be a conversation about what is the source of the bad things and the cruelties and so on that the United States has been up to over, let's say, the last few decades, from Vietnam to Iraq. And the answer that I would guard against in response to that is a kind of a left functionalist answer, which says that US policy is a product of corporate power done behind the backs of a deceived population. But I think a lot of the bad things the US has done have been done out of illusion, error, and mixed motives. But this isn't an answer. Dolores is saying, I know the temptation comes with oppression. How does one resist committing war crimes and prejudices right back? And not become a mirror of the invader? This is a very important question for anybody in Ukraine's position. I think it's important to allow oneself the freedom to feel unqualified rage, whereby you don't distinguish this or that and that or this on the other side. I think there will be a very small number of people always who don't even need to feel that, but that's a small number. And that's not necessarily better. It's okay to feel rage. And it's lucky for Ukraine that Ukraine is unlucky and lucky, but in this respect, it's lucky that Ukraine wouldn't be tempted to do anything ghastly the way things are looking anyway. But even if it were to, Western support wouldn't allow it. Um, but if you're talking about this kind of inner journey, then I think it's about um, understanding in a deep way that Ukraine cannot be an anti-Russia, that Ukraine needs to be Ukraine. And I think that's a very important thought that allows oneself to explore this sort of thing constructively. How do we sort of guard against, or how do they, Ukrainians, guard against this risk of becoming anti-Russia? That's just 4% of what might be explored as part of that question. RSH 6967 is asking, could you explain what you talk about when you say that you don't just want good faith conversations, you're okay with mixed faith conversations? My definition of good and bad faith doesn't easily admit a middle option, but I'm open to being corrected. So the conversations I ultimately love are free conversations where both people are thinking for themselves, not necessarily thinking originally, but thinking for themselves. And that's superior to good faith conversations, because one way of not being free in a conversation is for one's view to be well-meaning but pathological, right? That one's developed one's view, and that one's view is wrong, not because one's made a mistake, but because of psychopathology that caused one to make what looks like a mistake, but in fact isn't. It's something that is functional to something that's going on inside your mind, right? So imagine if somebody becomes a very dogged kind of ideologue, right? Because of unresolved issues about one's relationship with one's mother. And it's clear that that's where that stuff is coming from. What do you say about that person? Are they in good faith? Are they in bad faith? They're certainly not free. Right? Let's take a YouTube example. Imagine, let's stick with this example of somebody being an ideologue. Let's say we've got somebody who is a very committed Marxist, and they start a YouTube channel about contemporary politics. And imagine that because they're a Marxist, they despise woke politics. They believe that a movement like Black Lives Matter is got the right intent, but it's going about it completely the wrong way. It's not emphasizing the importance of class in the way Black folks in the United States are deprioritized. That's that person's message, that's person's opinion. They're broadcasting about that. But they notice that every time that they talk about problems with wokeness, a lot of Jordan Peterson fans come along, and that increases the view count of the video dramatically. So they talk about wokeness a bit more. And then little by little, they adopt just 5% of Jordan Peterson's worldview without being manipulative about it. They just sort of little by little drift into it because financial incentive, but much more importantly, audience capture and algorithmic incentive pushes them in a direction. And then 6 months down the line from starting their YouTube channel, they sort of complement these original Marxist views they started with a bit of, let us say, culture warring, cultural conservatism. Are they in good faith or in bad faith? The intent is there. The intent is fine. But they have drifted, and the causal element to explain their drift is algorithm, not exploration of ideas or change of mind. Is that mixed faith? Good faith? Bad faith? So this is the point. Virtually nobody has good faith conversations, because a conversation is a series of different games being played. And you'd have to give a very high ethical evaluation to every game that somebody is playing in a conversation to say it's a purely good faith conversation. And I actually believe you can pretty much do that with some people. But that's really rare. That's really, really rare. I know some people who are capable of it, but it's rare. So that's why I believe that I point out people who are simply and straightforwardly grifting, right? And you can pick people like that out. But for everybody else, I'm saying, please welcome, we're going to have a conversation, even if you are driven by some algorithmic incentives, or even if you are driven by your insecurity, or even if you are driven by the fact that some of the things you're pushing for are kind of things you've been financially rewarded for. I don't want that kind of purity, because if I want that purity, quite frankly, I'll be not engaging with fellow citizens. I'll be engaging with a very small number of academic philosophers, let us say, who are wearing jumpers with holes in them and have no friends. So that's why I am skeptical about this. Are you having a good or a bad faith conversation distinction? But we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this issue again. Edmuth is asking, what are your thoughts on recent events in the USA and UK, Vlad? Well, what recent events? In the UK, you've got a situation where an opposition party that is far ahead in the polls has got an identity crisis, and where the governing party has more than just an identity crisis. So it's a tricky situation, but vis-a-vis Ukraine, it doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter who is elected in the UK. The policy is roughly going to be the same. In the United States, I don't know what stories you're referring to. One of the recent stories is DeSantis getting involved in the education system in Florida. Let's mention that briefly, because it takes us back to the wokeness point. So Mr. DeSantis is on a anti-woke campaign, but what actually is happening in Florida isn't an attack on woke, it's an attack on academic freedom. To attack woke, you have to emphasize academic freedom, right? But what is instead happening is a political authoritarian takeover of academic institutions, right? And that's a very illuminating picture of the American political landscape at the level of discourse, at least, that there is a great deal of hyper-identity politics on the one side, but on the other, which is neither left nor liberal, it's its own thing. We've got to talk about how to frame it. Jordan Peterson and other people call that left. It's not. But then what's happened is that there's a wave coming against this hyper-identity politics that is a counter-revolutionary wave of anti-democratic conservatism, right? Because conservatism is democratic, right? An authoritarian conservatism. Conservatism is, in principle, has normatively impeccable democratic credentials and often believes in small government. This is not small government. This is a fascinating cultural conflict. The Kremlin is deciding whether they'll prefer DeSantis or Trump. And there is no decision, as far as I sense, made about that. Ursula from Vienna is asking, why are people so easily manipulated? One might think because they're dumb, and to a certain extent, this could be true, but certainly it's not true for all people. What is the root of this? Is it fear? At the moment, I believe that the key starting point for why people might be misinformed or manipulated is trust in institutions, which is in decline. And I've talked about this like a broken record. I've talked about citizens feeling that their government is incompetent, feeling that their government is working against them. We're escalating in significant levels of distrust, feeling that they're powerless, right? And most importantly, feeling that they're lost, that their political system has become opaque to them, which is why I always say, when people in sort of my YouTube bubble scream disinformation, Russian propaganda, I say, aha, no, underneath there's a crisis of trust. So most of our freakouts about disinformation should not be directed at the disinformation. They should be directed at the crisis of trust underneath. That is what allows the disinformation to flourish. Um, and another question, what do you think is the difference between the Kremlin's public response to the ICC arrest warrant and how they really feel about it? Well, think about it. I mean, imagine that you lived in a country that you knew would never give you out to the ICC, but imagine you wake up tomorrow with an ICC arrest warrant for you. How would you feel? You'd be stressed. So Mr. Putin himself isn't stressed about this, um, but people in his regime are. I could wake up with this tomorrow. And then if Mr. Putin keels over 6 years from now and I'm out of politics, I've got to go somewhere to give a lecture, somewhere to enjoy a holiday, somewhere to get some money out of a bank. Will I be stuck in Russia? How is this going to affect me? So this is absolutely stressful. And the fact that a middle ranking official has been hit by this is actually quite significant and is a bit of a wake-up call. Now, everybody, I think I have covered 90% of the questions that were left before, but this means that I have missed the majority of your questions that have come since. So let me have a little go. Mr. Putin is not worried about, Russell, Mr. Putin is not very worried about NATO expansion at the moment. He's worried about Ukraine. Suvara is asking, which Russian-speaking sources do you use, asking for a friend? I might share those too, but these would largely be individuals that I follow or individuals with little research projects or academics. The problem with academics is what you're following really is what they make of the latest situation rather than published research, because published research is so slow that it can't keep up with a war that just started a year ago. But I will share this. I was listening to an economic analysis of Russia yesterday, and I heard an amazing statistic that out of the 25 to 26 million children in Russia, something like 10.5 million are getting a government benefit, which is part of Mr. Putin. Can you imagine how much money that is? Which is part of Mr. Putin trying to um, appease and preempt discontent among the very worst off in society. Let us have a look. Is it possible that the war could end, that Putin is removed, but all the oppressive laws that were introduced since 2022, well, the oppressive laws started being introduced over a 10-year period, Suvara. Is it possible they would stay in place? Yes, it's possible. I mean, Western governments couldn't really do much about that because they're not going to invade Russia unless this goes really, really, really badly. If we've invaded Russia, this means this war has escalated pretty dramatically. Sativis is asking, Vlad, what are the prospects for Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian emigres returning home under different scenarios of the war ending? Love from Rotterdam. Love back. I'm feeling a lot of pain, particularly for Belarusians at the moment, because outer Russians and Belarusians, because frustratingly, civically, Belarus is much closer to being ready for a democracy than Russia is. So with Belarus, it's such a simple matter, really, that if you got rid of the Kremlin influence and then you got rid of the Agroführer, then what would happen um, is that it would not be very difficult to get that country along a democratic path, in my assessment. Um, but I think that the the problem is you don't know when change is gonna happen. So you don't know, if you are in Georgia, if you've managed to escape somewhere in indeed even in Western Europe or North America, how long are you away for? Is it going to be 5 years? Is it going to be 15 years? How do you frame this for yourself? Um, and you know, what will you be returning to? So the trouble is that when you're dealing with tyrannies of this kind, they're eminently unpredictable. The Putin regime could unravel really fairly quickly, um, but it might stay in power for a long time. So this is really, sort of planning one's life through uncertainty. D is asking, now that almost anyone can engineer cheap new biological weapons, how long do we have before countries develop a virus and a vaccine that will kill entire humankind? Um, there's a risk there that's big. At the moment, I would rate higher the risk of another pandemic that is not an act of war, but just happens. And I would also worry more about potentially climate change mediated new um, pathogens being liberated that we haven't, uh, as a species, been in contact with for thousands upon thousands of years. Um, and I'm also worried about the range of various kinds of diseases spread by mosquitoes, for example, uh, uh, just completely expanding pretty much to cover the whole planet. That at the moment is constrained to particular belts. So I think this is a really significant worry, but I'm complementing it with other worries. Is the future of Kazakhstan after uh, what is the future of Kazakhstan after defeating Mr. Putin? And is the future of Central Asia dependent on the future of Russia? Look, I I wouldn't be worried if I were in Kazakhstan of a Putin invasion, given how preoccupied he is in Ukraine. I do see Russia as having evacuated all soft power in the region. And so I think the answer to your question depends on how Russia reconstitutes itself. But I think the tough point is that something is going to be on that space, and you're going to reckon with it if you are Russia's neighbors. There's just no way to avoid that. And what that means is that unless you're a Ukrainian who just doesn't have the mental energy to engage with this stuff because of Russia's brutal invasion of your home, um, you have to, in the end, return to the question of how you're going to relate to Russia, future Russia. What are you going to expect from it? What are you going to offer it? And if it's not it, because it's not there in the same shape, then what are you going to, how are you going to envisage your dealings with whatever is on that space? Um, and I do think that, of course, if Russia took a particularly positive direction, that would be very beneficial for the region. But obviously, one's got to be pessimistic about that, the odds of that happening. Mr. Putin is going to have, as far as this is not my area, but Mr. Putin is going to have immunity as the leader of a country that is going to clash um, with the requirement to send him off to the ICC. Um, I, I I don't think Putin is going to be worried about visiting countries, but I think some countries will be more cautious about inviting him. There's no doubt about that. But that woman, Russia's ombudswoman for children's rights, would very likely be arrested in all the countries that have ratified um, the treaty behind the ICC. Any thoughts on John Gray's column in the New Statesman about the West's goals in this war still being clueless and incoherent as they had been during the demolition of Iraq? What Gray thinks fundamentally went wrong in Iraq is that the West, well, those bits of the West that got involved, thought that they could get rid of Saddam Hussein without getting rid of the Iraqi state. And that was an illusion, one of many illusions. I think that the West does not have a clear post-war strategy. But more disturbingly, the West does not have a clear war strategy. The West's strategy is to put Ukraine in a stronger position and see what happens, and draw a red line around Ukraine's independence. Ukraine is going to survive this, and there is no question about that, certainly as far as the Biden administration goes. But that's it. That's it. There is very little thinking about what to do with Russia. There's very little thinking about how to engage with Russia even today, with potential forces in Russia that might be taking over after Putin, that might be opposed to Putin. Russian opposition themselves struggle with that. There is not enough thinking about the interconnectedness, regional interconnectedness of potential democratic flourishing. How Belarus is dependent on Ukraine and Ukraine is dependent on Belarus. There is no knockdown countermeasure to Mr. Putin's plan to potentially wait a year or two and see what happens. And if you speak to thinking Ukrainians who are able to take a distance and really reflect on this, they're very concerned that the West is not coming up with a clear story about what it's proposing for them, what it's proposing for them post-war, and what it's proposing for them before the war. And one of the problems with this community is that you watch a whole bunch of very good videos that say, go Ukraine and look at how silly the Russians are, but you're not sufficiently cognizant, right? Many of you are, but not enough of you, of the fact that you are watching a strategic car crash. Right? There is no clear strategy that the West has in this conflict. Yeah. We're going to talk about what it means to develop one, and we're going to talk about what strategy might be helpful. For example, the strategy of a commitment to a maximally rapid Ukrainian victory. That needs to be defined and elaborated. But at the moment, there's a real vacuum there beyond just saying Ukraine's going to survive and we'll support it after it survives. That is not enough. And certainly Mr. Putin is very aware that that's not enough and he's happy about it. So there's a real problem here. And it's very important that we don't just sit around, because this is not simply about protecting Ukraine. Our national interests are at stake here. Your national interest, if you're in the United States or in Canada, is at stake here. If you're in France or Germany, your national interest is at stake. So we've got to talk about this more. I haven't read John Gray's piece, but if he's saying that we lack strategic clarity, he's right. So that was a rant without much explanation, but that's because we'll keep coming back to this, because I think this is important. George is asking, is Lvova Belova, this ombudswoman for kids, would she be an expression of the banality of evil if we put her on trial? That depends on whether she was a paper pusher or whether she was more an innovator and more an instigator. And I don't know enough to settle this. But people at the top are rarely just paper pushers. In other words, the banality of evil analysis works very, very well, except for the people who are running things, because their instigators are often very creative. They're not banal. I think the future of Kaliningrad, in the context of a Russia that falls apart, would be interesting. I'm not sure, Daniel, what I can say. What I can say beyond that. We're going to have to have ourselves, maybe with the help of a couple of guests, a conversation about what it really means to think about Russia disintegrating realistically, right? Not as in, oh God, I've had enough of these Russians, they keep invading us. Can they just fall apart? But have a realistic conversation about that. What would it look like? Is it a good thing or a bad thing, or neither, and so on. Do I think about inviting Ukrainian East European things? Yeah. I just haven't had conversations. I've begun to have conversations in the last few weeks about having conversations, just a little tiny bit. So that'll happen. But you know what? You mentioned the Ukrainian philosopher Andrei Baumeister. I don't know. I know he is perfect in German. I don't know how perfect. I don't know how his English is. Would he talk in English? Um, we could talk. I don't speak Ukrainian. We could talk in Russian, but I'm not good at talking philosophy in Russian. Let's have a look. Nikolai, thank you very, very much. Let me just click to so that I can see all chat. I think this thing is not showing me all the chats. Yeah, Daniel, sorry I didn't answer your question properly. Hello, Crystal. Do I think there is any basis to the argument that some oligarchs should be granted amnesty from the sanctions? For example, the Friedman case. So what happened is that Alexei Navalny's organization had a challenge because a leading figure in that organization, possibly without their consent, signed a little paper to get a couple of Russian businessmen out of the sanctions. I think that the personalized sanctions situation is a disaster at the moment. because you need to have a clear parameter of who is in and who is out. So when this isn't clearly defined, what you have is an arbitrariness that is completely politically unconstructive. Because what you want to say to people is, ha ha ha, you're going to be in this bad list, but here is the exit strategy. This is what it entails. If you go through it, you're going to come out of it. So that requires really transparency and a good measure of individuality also in the way these cases are handled. But this is central to, as it were, splitting Russian elites away from Putin and also away from silence. However, you also have to understand that for a long time there have been no oligarchs in Russia. Anybody who has got a lot of wealth is just Mr. Putin's wallet without any political power. But this business of how we are thinking about different kinds of sanctions needs to be returned to, because in the case of most of the sanctions we're implementing, they are not having the effect most people think that they're supposed to have. That doesn't mean the sanctions are wrong, because partly they aren't right or wrong, they're just necessary anyway, because you have to respond. But we have to have this conversation, because much of what we're doing is, for example, consolidating the Putin regime. Could we do better? So we will have these conversations. We might have a sanctions specific episode.